Well, welcome back, everybody. It's another Monday, but certainly not another Monday for all of you. The world's kind of on its head right now. Everybody's settled in, or going to get settled into their fully virtual classrooms. So we're going to continue on though with our path, and this week we're going to talk about biodigital devices, and I'll define those in a second. But biodigital devices really are the wave of the future when it comes to specifically and almost exclusively access control, but also some video recognition systems as well. But biodigital is something that you certainly will be working with as you go forward. When Dr. Wisniewski is long since dead, you guys will be deep in your careers and be doing this and calling it old hat technology. But right now, in the security realm, it's relatively new, and so let's dive right into this. So let's start with definitions, and as you know, our definitions may be different than definitions in another field. For an elementary school teacher, a reader is a person normally in the first grade who is learning how to read. To us, it is a device we use to perhaps open a door. So every field has their own definitions for terms, and this is no different with biodigital devices. You may also hear these called biometric devices. That's really not as accurate as it used to be, and because metrics does comparisons of different data sets, and this may not be that. So biodigital is the new term used for these types of security devices, and a biodigital device includes any hardware form of human integrated technology. So there has to be a thing. That's the one thing that you need to remember when it comes to biodigital devices. There has to be a physical device. It is not simply a software thing or something that's vapor, right? There's a hardware piece of equipment that forms a human integrated technology. Biodigital devices provide a unique and consistent identifier of the holder or wearer of the technology. So everyone's biodigital device must be able to tell you one person from another, and it must also be consistent. So it can't tell you that's Brian 1 minute and then come back with some other reading the next. It has to be consistent, okay? And it's used to allow or deny access, show the presence of an individual, or integrate with another system to provide additional information about the holder or wearer. So it's a hardware piece, right? It's a device, and it provides unique and consistent identification of a person, and it's used to do something, to let them in somewhere, to show they belong, or to give you additional information about that person. A device provides unique and consistent identification for some physical purpose. So certainly biodigital devices are not purely security devices. There are plenty of biodigital devices out there. Artificial organs, right? They can be monitored. Things like pacemakers, right? A person has a pacemaker. The doctor uses a device to monitor the pacemaker to make sure it is keeping a proper rhythm, that it is strong, that it is operating efficiently, and they do that through feedback. So the body is telling us that this is the heartbeat. The pacemaker is providing that heartbeat, really regulating the timing of it, and we're using the information for a purpose, right? Brainwave technologies, high-tech e-skin, right? You can take your hand, essentially, and move your hand in some programs now, and it will do things. You don't need to be wearing anything, right? It's just a mimicking program of sorts. Smart tattoos, implantable RFID chips. We've all seen those on the news. People get an RFID chip implanted in them for one reason or another. Frankly, a biodigital device is the smart chip that it is in each of my dogs. I have them implanted with a chip to find them, and it is a biodigital device, technically, because it provides feedback and a unique identification. So there are plenty of non-security devices, and we're going to come back to those in a little bit, because do they have a potential security use, and then what would be the pitfalls of that? So we'll talk about that really at the end of the lecture, but just think about the fact that biodigital devices, we're going to be talking about the security functions, but there are plenty of other functions out there. But it's not all high-tech pacemakers and artificial organs and those things. Think about biodigital feedback. I tell Siri to start my car. It's using my voice to start my car. It is using a unique identifier with the device, the cell phone, to have some sort of action taken, starting my car. My Apple Watch tells me it's time to stand up because it's been monitoring the fact that I've been sitting on my butt for too long, and it says, hey, time to stand. It doesn't do that if I've been walking around. It is using the input and my unique identification to tell me that it's time. It knows that I've been walking around or haven't been walking around. It tells me to stand up. Even the Face ID on your Apple Watch or your Android phone, right, is a biodigital device. It's using facial recognition as the type of device, right? The camera is the device, and it's a unique identifier, and it is allowing you to then access your phone because you've went through the device and the unique identification, and it is consistent. If you, it doesn't work one time and not work the next. If it did, you'd turn it off, right? It is very consistent, the facial recognition on a phone, which very much is dumbed down, by the way, and we'll get into facial recognition a little bit, but it is very consistent. You can make faces, you can be in the dark, and it really is a very consistent technology, and it always picks the right person. I have not seen anybody try to open up someone else's iPhone and be successful using facial recognition, so it's pretty reliable. There are some very common uses in security for biodigital devices. Access control is probably the most prevalent. Although we will talk about video surveillance, access control seems to be the big player in this. And it could be simple permission, just like a badge. Brian belongs in the room. Brian presents his digital credential, if you will, the biodigital marker, and it is unique, and it is consistent, and we allow him in. Simple permission. But it can also be used for various other things. You can tie these systems in to not just let me in or let me out, but it could be an area that the only thing that keeps you from going in is a medical clearance, right? So it could be used on a room that has an X-ray machine in it, right? If you have a dosimeter and you've been issued one of those, then it will let you in, and it's really tied back to that medical credentialing and data, right? So you can tie it into other data. Training, if you've been properly trained on something, then you can just tap it into a training system and say, there's the permission I'm looking for. It has nothing to do with access control, really, as far as letting me in and out. The area may be open, with the exception of you can only do certain things in that area or get into a certain room because of your training. And the presence of safety items. This one's particularly interesting. We have hand geometry readers I've seen set up. Most recently, I think it was at JFK Airport, where you have to wear rubber gloves, latex gloves, medical gloves, to go into a certain area. And when you put your hand in the hand geometry reader, which we'll talk about in a bit, it reads the bones in your hand, the unique size and layout. It also checks to make sure you're wearing your glove. And if you put your hand on there without a latex glove, and without the latex glove from a 3D perspective, reading all the way around, then you're not going to get in either. So it's looking for certain things. Access control, just the basic open the door, close the door because you're allowed, is certainly one. But there are other things to tie into any kind of access control, really, but biodigital primarily, because it's usually used for that type of higher end access with other things you need to have done. Video surveillance, facial recognition software in particular, is really a crowd scanning technology. It can be used for access control, but there are some major drawbacks to it, and we'll go over those primarily next week, but we'll touch on them this week. But it's mostly for crowd scanning. So we use video surveillance and facial recognition to look at a crowd going into a stadium, to look at people going into certain government buildings, to see if they match up with persons that have the same unique and consistent digital markers that match up, so that we can keep those people out, or at least we can divert them from coming in until we do additional screening. So there's a lot of common security uses. There are more, but these are the ones primarily. Normally there is no connection between biodigital and alarm systems, although they can be used on standalone alarm systems to turn them on and off. Usually one of the reasons you use a standalone is it's a bit cheaper, so you probably would not include more expensive. And biodigital devices are far more expensive than the standard access control and video surveillance systems that you'd use. So normally they are not used on lower end systems. So some of the more common biodigital security devices are facial recognition, voice recognition, retina scan, fingerprint readers, hand geometry, phones, watches, and wearables, and implanted RFID and smart chips. So we'll go over each one of these individually, but again, just make sure that you're going back to that definition. For it to be a biodigital device, it has to be a device, right? A thing. That thing has to pick up on a unique and consistent identifier. That's some kind of a biologic, right? Your voice, your fingerprints, your eyes, your face, something unique. And then use that for some security purpose, to open and close the door, to allow you in and out, or to pull you out of a crowd to create better security. So before we get too far and go over each one of these, I want you to consider, as we did with cameras, there's the right tool for the right job. And although facial recognition or retina scan may sound very high tech and remind you of movies you've seen on TV, you really want to match the technology just as you're matching the camera to the problem, right? So one of the things to consider is the registration and the samples. Is it self-registration, or are you required to submit some sample, some biological sample? So when we talk about phones, you'll understand that a little bit better. But in most cases, you have to submit some kind of a sample of your fingerprint, a sample of your retina, a sample of your voice, in order for it to work. In other cases, the sample has already been provided and you're just providing a device. The level of consistency, okay? Does the sample change, and can changes be accommodated easily? Think about injuries. Think about winter gear. Think about wearing a hat if you're using facial recognition. There are a lot of things that could interfere with the level of consistency. And can those changes, taking off your hat's pretty easy. Taking off a head dress that you wear for religious purposes is not. So we have to think about the level of consistency and how hard is it to get that level of consistency. You have to think about speed. Some of these are really fast technologies, just like running a card on a card reader and boom, you're in. And others take time to go through the algorithms to indeed make a decision as to whether or not the person should be accessed or whether or not they meet the criteria, right? That final level of unique identification, right? Consistent identification takes longer with some of these technologies. So you have to consider speed, and that means your throughput. How many people are actually going through that particular area? Can you accommodate that? The degree of human interaction. Some of these are really low touch, non-touch, no action at all required. Others require a set amount of action by the user and, in fact, some level of training. So you have to consider that. And then privacy implications. Next week, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about privacy. We'll touch on it a little bit this week. But I guess when you're looking at these things, don't think so much about this looks more high tech, therefore it must be better. I always say, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Is it worth this high tech entry system if indeed you don't need it, and if indeed it's going to require more time, more training, it's going to require people to change their habits. Those things are all things you must consider when you're going to use these things. And make sure that if you are going to use any type of biodigital device, it really is necessary and it really does match the threat, right? It matches the area you're going to use it at, because just using it on a common front door may or may not be your best answer depending on which technology you choose. So now we're going to play a little game of, pros and cons of each one of these types of technologies so that you kind of understand whether or not you might want to use them in a certain situation. So facial recognition is the use of multiple facial features to provide a unique identifier. Sometimes they use the bone structure in the face. Some of them are 3D. Some of them are really simple systems. I know that I use facial recognition on my iPhone, right, to get into things. I also know that I used to use fingerprint reader to get into my financial program. I know that my fingerprint, when I would use it to get into some programs, it took a little longer, and others I just had to touch it. That normally is because they're looking for a reduced number of features, right? So the pros of a facial recognition system really is that they're getting better, right? So it used to be that they were pretty iffy, right? The unique identifier and the consistency was a problem. They also have simple registration, right? You really don't need any other devices once you're registered. We're not giving you another credential. You're walking around with that attached to your head, right? Your face isn't going anywhere. So there's no other devices needed other than the device that reads it. So the device, the biometric device or the biodigital device is the camera that's reading the face, right? Simple registration. It requires unobstructed views, okay? And again, someone who wears religious or medical items as either a preference or a right, you may have issues. And in fact, there have been known issues with facial recognition for access control with people who wear turbans, right? Because there's a certain amount of forehead space that's being measured normally with these things, right? So there's a whole lot of different markers that it's looking for. It's looking for depths. It's looking for sizes. It's basically a 3D kind of a thing coming off the camera. And if you are wearing a headdress of any kind, then you have to potentially remove it in some of these systems. And if it's for religious reasons, then that's not really an option. So that's a problem. And then the big problem with facial recognition is it reads everyone. So if I'm walking up toward a door and I'm going to use facial recognition to get in, it's going to read my face and it's going to say my face is in the system essentially, and boom, the door opens. But if I walk near that door and I don't want to come in, I'm not requesting anything, it's still reading my face. And my face may not be in the system, but basically you are using my face without my permission to make a decision. There is no real activity by the user with facial recognition, and therefore there are some significant privacy issues. Next week, again, we're going to be talking about the general data privacy requirements in Europe and the new California laws on privacy and video recognition. They may do what they've done with me and pretty much told me that facial recognition is not something that I really want to get into because there are so many restrictions now. So privacy is a big thing because it reads everyone that comes near it without that person having to request anything, because the system itself just looks for you, finds you, and starts making decisions even if you haven't asked for anything. So voice recognition, it's been around for a very long time. It uses the user's voice to provide the unique identifier. Everyone's voice makes a different voice print, and it's very simple registration. I mean, you do it with Siri and Alexa and others and Google Home to register to use your voice to tell it things. And in some cases, it requires your voice as opposed to any voice, right? With the basic operations of a Amazon Dot, I just say Alexa, and she wakes up and she does things. I say play a song, she plays the song. But if I want to use it for something like lock my front door, then it's actually looking at my voice. It's looking for that voice print. It's using the voice recognition, or it asks me for a code, one of the two. It asks for another identifier, right? But the simple registration really is just recognition of your voice. Same thing with Siri. If you say Siri a number of times when you first set up your phone, it asks you to say a few things, so it sets it up. And it allows for added actions. And that's the big thing with voice recognition is it's not just using, as with your face, it just uses your face to open a door, let's say. But with voice, you can actually tell it to do other things. You can say open the door and hold it for 15 seconds. You can say open the door and leave it open. You can say open the door and lock it when I go through, if that's what you wanted to do. There are other voice commands you can use. That's a big pro of voice recognition, is that you can have multiple commands. The cons, it really isn't as reliable as we'd hoped. And voice recognition for access control has been out for 20 years. They were using it at the African American Museum in Detroit back in the late 80s. I went down and looked at it, and it was really cool, but it didn't work about half the time. You had to keep saying your name until it finally recognized you. And how many times have we asked Siri to do something for us and she does something totally different? Or Alexa or the Google Home, we say, what are my notifications? And it starts reading off the definition of the word notification, right? It hears what it wants to hear. It could be that we're not saying things properly, but we all know that voice recognition is not as reliable as we would hope because it often doesn't do the things we ask it to do. That is a big con, especially if you have a high throughput area where you're trying to get people through. and there's also background noise and multiple people saying something at the same time, you could have issues with voice recognition. It's not a technology that I'd recommend for security purposes, although it does have its place, and you may want to use it some places. I just would not recommend it for those reasons. Retina scans are another biodigital device that's been out there for a very long time. First time I saw retina scans was at the weapons storage area of a major police department. And they'd put in a retina scan, and you walked up and you put your eye to a little reader, and it took about 3-4 seconds to run a beam, and then it would unlock the door. So it's highly accurate. The retina is a unique, very unique identifier. Everyone's is a little different. It's got a very long history. Again, this is something that's been out there for 20 plus years. Not used as much as other technologies, but it's been out there for a very long time, and it is still obviously available. And you see it a lot in the movies, right? Going into high security areas, read the retina. The cons. Well, first off, it's very slow. It takes a fair amount of time to read the retina, and even if it reads it right away, it takes a little while for you to get up close enough to get it done. There are some retina scans now that actually, I saw one not too long ago that the unit itself will adjust to find the retina, and you can do it from a little bit of a distance. I have not seen whether it's reliable or not. It looked like a cool technology, but just because it's cool doesn't mean it works. But the big con to me is the General Motors example. And General Motors started to use retina scans on a lot of places in their factories, and in fact started to use it in a couple of them to test for time and attendance. So when you walked up, instead of hitting a time card, you clocked in, if you would, with your retina. This kept people from punching other people's time cards, which is pretty common in a lot of places. Any place that has a time card, you'll always find someone who says, "Hey, I'm going to be late, punch me in," and someone will do that for them. It is, by the way, considered theft. Theft of time is indeed breaking the law, but people don't see it that way sometimes. They see it as a policy thing, but it is actually a legal thing. But the GM example, people came in for a number of years and clocked in that way. And then a number of them retired. And the funny thing about retirement, and you'll hear this from everybody, and someday you'll hear it from me, your retirement check is never as big as you thought it was going to be. If you have a pension, you always thought it was going to be X, and then you find out, well, all these things come out of it. Excuse me. Taxes, spousal benefits, insurance benefits, your medical, all these things come out. You expected to make $20,000 a year, and you're actually making 12 because everything came out of it, right? And GM saw that once these people started to retire, they were getting a fair number of lawsuits about damage to eyes from the retina scan. And although it could be proven that they did no damage, they were reading, they were not doing anything but that, and the medical testing had been done for some period of time, GM found it easier in some cases to just pay out some money to make the lawsuits go away, because to defend a lawsuit would have been probably $20,000 with lawyer time and court costs and everything else, and to settle for 10 was a good business decision. But there was a perceived physical harm, whether real or whether simply claimed because they knew these folks knew they were going to get some money, and that's not a disparaging remark on General Motors workers by any stretch. This was a limited number of workers, but they claimed that they were hurt by these things. General Motors made a payout, and then they started to get away from that, the retina scan, for clocking in and out, and started to use other biodigital type devices, or simply electronic time cards with access control cards. But that's really the big thing, is that there was a perceived harm. Think about, your eyes are a very sensitive thing, and people perceive that may hurt them using that every day. Even though it's been medically proven not to be the problem, it is a perception, and that is a con for retina scans. Now, as part of the lesson this week, I asked you to view a video from Ademia on their MorphoTrust reader. Again, not an endorsement. It's just one I'm very familiar with. It is a very good example of the technology, so that's why I used it. Please, there are, unfortunately, in this type of course, I will show you different brands of things. There's no way around it, really. If you want to see the examples, you're going to look at different brands. Don't look at them as endorsements. You're going to be a security professional and business professional on your own right, and you will make those decisions. Fingerprint readers use a selectable number of fingerprint ridges and furrows to verify identity. The ridges are the raised part of a fingerprint. The furrows are the sunken-in valley parts. Remember that because it's kind of a cool factoid, if you will. The ridges and furrows, and that verifies that unique identity. Okay. The pros of fingerprint readers are that they're absolutely accepted because everybody understands that your fingerprint is that one unique thing that everybody has different than everyone else. At least that's what we're told. We'll never really know because there are 7.5 billion people on this planet. I don't know if one of them has the same fingerprint as me. I mean, we would have to have an example of it happening. And with the limited number of fingerprints that are taken, frankly, we never will be able to really know. But for the most part, I think that there's an acceptance of the uniqueness of fingerprints. The new devices will encrypt, so you don't have to store the raw fingerprint data. That's hugely important from a privacy perspective. Again, we'll talk privacy next week. But if I go in to register, I go in and a machine takes my fingerprints, turns them immediately into a unique digital series, ones and zeros, right? Something that cannot be rebuilt in the other direction. So now when I go to the reader and I present, it's simply translating that into the number and looking for the match of the number. Nowhere are the fingerprints stored anymore. Old systems used to store the fingerprint either in the device or in a central database, the actual fingerprint, and it would do the matchup. You see that on TV where they take the fingerprint and they overlay the one they have, and it's always an exact match. Don't know exactly how they do that since fingerprints are seldom done at the same angle exactly every time, but you really don't store the fingerprint itself anymore. You collect the fingerprint and immediately turn it into a number, and then when the person presents the hand, that translates into the number again, and then it matches the two numbers. So that's a pro that you don't have to keep that. The cons of fingerprint readers, injuries. If you change your fingerprint, right, you get a serious cut, a burn, then obviously if you're using a single fingerprint reader, which there are some that just read one fingerprint or a thumbprint, the injury is going to matter. On top of injuries, and I didn't list it here, where in medical places, if you are wearing gloves, then it's not going to read through. So therefore, you've got an issue, right? So that is a con as well. And then there's the whole trust thing. Even though, as I told you, we're taking those fingerprints and we're turning them into a digital number, right? We don't store the fingerprints. People really have a lot of trust issues with their fingerprints. They understand that people go to jail because their fingerprints match something. They don't want their fingerprints as something that is just generally available to other people. And so there are some trust issues there because people understand it, but because for decades and decades, they've understood that people have gone to jail because their fingerprints matched something. And they don't want a mistake to be made, and therefore they're very protective of it. So it's a con because you have some salesmanship to do and some training to show people how the data is collected, how it's held. And again, when we talk about the privacy next week, we'll go into that in real depth. But fingerprint readers, the downside is that people tend to worry a little bit about what happens with those fingerprints. So hand geometry and somewhat similarly the finger vein readers, as you saw in the text, they use unique bone size and structure or venal structure to identify the person, right? You basically walk up to one of these readers and it has 1, 2, 3, 4 pegs, and you slide your hand in between the pegs and it separates them out into a certain pattern, and then it looks for your hand geometry, right? Heavily used in the government for a very long time where they needed biodigital devices, high security areas. They used hand geometry a lot in airports, in the customs areas of airports, and other places. Hand geometry, LAX used hand geometry and still does in a lot of places. Los Angeles International Airport. So since it's been used in the government and pseudo-government agencies, it's very well tested. So it's been out there for a while, and it does work, right? The issue is that it's slow to respond, right? So when you have to go up and you have to line your fingers and get them in there and set them there for a minute, and then it takes a second to take a look and make a decision. And then you pull your hand out of it. You're touching stuff. You have to line your hands up the right way, and it has to take a second to read, not for a high volume area if you're trying to get a lot of people through an area. The other thing is that the readers themselves they're kind of finicky, quite frankly, and they have the pins, right? The pegs that you put in between your fingers when you slide your hand into the thing. they tend to get moved around a little bit, and even the slightest movement has given issues with these readers. From people I've talked to that use them consistently, say that they are kind of finicky. They do require some maintenance. So a good tested technology that can be finicky and slow. So you can't use it in a high throughput area, but you can use it in a low throughput area, right? A high security area where there's not a lot of activity going through the door. And if indeed you're willing to take on the potential cost of maintenance because of the finickiness of the pins in these things, they are a decent technology to use, and they certainly are accepted and well tested. So you're not going out there on a branch and may fall off, right, because you're trying something brand new. It's really a tried and tested technology. So the big one now is the mobile credential and using your cell phone or your smartwatch to provide the identifier. Walk up, you have an app on your phone, you hold it up to the reader, it identifies that's your phone, and it lets you in. Okay, very low hurdle on registration. You have to have the app, and the app does cost some money, so the company or the entity that puts up the access control or whatever you're going to use this for has to pay for the app, right? But the registration is simply, the matter of, if I have an iPhone, I either have a 4 or 6 digit PIN code, or I use facial recognition to let me in the phone, and then the app on the phone says it's okay to let me in because this is me that's using the phone. Many users provide the credential. Just about everybody carries a cell phone, but that's not an absolute, right? The cons are that credentials can be traded because you're not actually taking the credential. You're not putting the data in to verify that identity. Someone else is. So when you get your cell phone and you set up your facial recognition, and then you use your cell phone to get in a door, you use it as your credential, as your badge, if you will. You provided the credential, okay? You provided the verification, the identity information, and then used it. I never did verify that, and I can go in and change my facial ID on my phone anytime I want to. So if I want to let my wife into someplace, I can just go back in and erase my facial ID and have her take her picture a couple of times. Now my phone works with her face, and it can be traded. So unlike the hand geometry and the fingerprint readers and the facial recognition and others, you can trade the credential on wearables and on watches, right? The phones and the watches work about the same way. So it's a secondary verification. The person who's protecting it, the security manager, is not the one who's issuing the ID. They're issuing the app, and that goes with the phone, but the actual ID of the person is controlled by the holder of that phone. And then the other thing is that not all people have a cell phone or a watch or a wearable of some kind. There's a cost to provide. In fact, when you have even Verizon and Apple don't provide cell phones to their janitorial staff. And if the person says, that's great, that's what we're going to use to get in, you need to give me a cell phone to get in because I don't have one. You've kind of backed yourself into a corner, because if that is the only requirement you have, then you indeed will provide that. Now you have a potentially, minimum $30, $40 per month cost to provide a credential to a limited number of users. And frankly, the limited number of users is not as limited as you would think. I think 7 or 8% of people in the U.S. don't have a cell phone. It may even be higher than that. I'd have to look it up, but it's not a minimal number, really. Not just a few here and there. It's a good portion of a workforce. And the other part is that it is skewed toward those who cannot afford them. So you're asking someone to provide the credential, the actual device. And in this case, you're asking people to provide something that costs money, and it exponentially hurts those who can't afford it. So it's a controversial thing. Everybody's really for, I just want to use my cell phone to get in because I have my cell phone. Two things. I can't really verify it's you. I can only verify that I issued you the app. You've identified the person who's going to use it because you have control over that on your phone. And number two, not everybody carries a cell phone, and I don't really want to be the guy to say that you can't get into my building because you can't afford a cell phone. So more and more companies are using these, and it's a great technology in that way because it's very convenient. The other thing that you need to know about phones are a lot of times they're using Bluetooth. And Bluetooth, as you know, can be read from a certain distance. And if you've got people going through very fast in an area, I don't know whether I'm letting in the person who's first in line or second in line if they're only feet apart. So you really have to dumb it down. When you do that, it means you have to place your phone essentially on the device because you don't want it to pick up extraneous signals, and then it makes the decision. That takes about 1 to 2 seconds, and that's going to slow you down some. So as high-tech as it seems and simple as it seems, it's slow simply because you can't have it read from too far away because it'll pick up too many users. And finally, I'd like to talk about the implanted RFID and smart chips. So it's a physically implanted device for identity verification. Again, I put a chip in my dogs in case they get lost. And most vets today and all humane societies and dog pounds, if you will, around the country have a reader, and they just scan the back of the neck because it always goes in the same spot, and they can find out who the dog belongs to if it lost its collar and got away. People are doing this. Not too long ago, there was one company in California that asked for volunteers to use the RFID chip for access control and other purposes. And some 200 employees volunteered to have these things put in the back of their wrist. One thing is that, first off, it's not real user-friendly. Anytime you got to basically cut somebody's skin or give them a tattoo or something, you're causing some pain and potentially some infection and other things, right? But they're not conducive to tech changes. Okay, if the technology on my cell phone changes, I throw away my phone, I get a new one, right? If my Apple Watch technology changes so much that I need a new one, I go out and buy a new one. If indeed the tech changes to my implanted chip, oops, I'm getting another small cut put in so that that one can be taken out and another one put in. And as quickly as Apple comes out with new iPhones, I don't think I want to be going to a medical suite to have a chip put in me every so often, or to have my tattoo erased and a new one done. So, as cool as that might be, right? The whole chip in the forehead thing, as we used to laugh about back in the 70s and 80s. At some point, the government will put a chip in your forehead and, we'll all be tracked. Technology changes so fast that by the time you put that chip in my forehead, it's no longer valid, and you got to find a new chip. So it's cool. You'll see it. You'll read about it. It's really fun to watch how how technology is changing. But I would think that implanted devices are simply something that will not be acceptable to most humans from a medical standpoint, if nothing else. So do with it what you will. If you suggest in your project that you're going to put chips in everybody's skin to get them in and out of your warehouse, I would suggest that you probably weren't listening, because that's not going to fly. So as we talked about these different devices, and we started with biodigital devices being not just security based, but based on other things. Artificial joints, right, can have a device in them so that they can be tracked, so we can tell what the wear and tear is on them. Pacemakers certainly are tracked outside the body with a device, right? They're providing some feedback, and we're using that to make decisions on your health. Insulin pumps that go into people's bodies. I mean, there are so many devices now that, medically may be necessary, but then also could be used, I think, for identity verification. My pacemaker, if I had one, and I do not, but if I had one, would be unique to me. It would be implanted in my body, just like that RFID chip we talked about, but it would be there, and it would send off a signal. And could I not have a reader that simply said that here's the serial number? I know that serial number on that pacemaker belongs to Brian, and therefore I've verified that that is Brian coming to the door. The answer is absolutely yes. No matter what you have, if it's sending out a unique signal and it is uniquely identifying you, then it could be used as a biodigital device for security purposes. But I'd like you to stop the lecture for just a second and just jot down 1 or 2 drawbacks that you can think of that might be problematic if we were to use that type of device for security purposes. So if indeed you did stop the video and think about this and jot some things down, hopefully the word privacy or something similar to it came up in 1 or more of the things that you might have listed. Should we be forced to provide information on our medical issues to our employer? Well, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, known as HIPAA, which is 46 Code of Federal Regulations Part 160, So you can look it up that way if you put in 46 CFR Part 160. The Code of Federal Regulations is always annotated that way. There are many of them having to do with security. And a lot of them have to do with pharmaceuticals, and a lot of them have to do with manufacturing. They all have a different series. The 46 series is about health. And basically it says that you don't have to share those things. So let's talk about the old pacemaker thing, right? So if I have a pacemaker, and even voluntarily I say, sure, use the signal from my pacemaker to let me get in and out of doors, right? If you have that type of reader available and you hook it up, easy. I walk up to the door, it gets the signal from my pacemaker, says, yep, that serial number on that device in Brian's chest matches up, it's Brian, let him in. But maybe I need a new pacemaker. And what might my employer assume, right or wrong, if I need a new pacemaker? Perhaps I may be off on medical leave for a while. Perhaps I have an underlying medical condition that is severe now to the fact that my old pacemaker wasn't cutting it. It's getting worse, and therefore, and the employer might start to make business decisions based on that. With any biodigital device, we have to be careful to make sure that we are not getting information that we don't need on top of that which we do to affect the entry process. So in the case of the pacemaker, we would be getting the information, the serial number. But if I went in and told them that my serial number has changed because I had a new pacemaker put in, the employer might make an assumption that indeed I have a serious heart issue beyond just what a normal pacemaker might indicate because I'm having it replaced, and start to make business decisions like maybe it's time for Brian to go. Maybe he's, it's too much stress. Maybe I shouldn't give him assignments that stress him because, he's got that pacemaker and they just changed it. So obviously there's something going on. You have to be very careful with biodigital devices that you're not collecting too much information beyond what you need to make the decision of the unique identification. You can't really collect information. We're going to be going over privacy next week at more depth, but I wanted to mention it because when you start to look at these things, start to think a little bit paranoid about what could be used, what information am I giving up? What privacy am I giving up when I use a biodigital device for security purposes? And when you're the installer of those things, you have to think because people will come to you with those privacy concerns. So takeaways for this week, the definitions of biodigital devices for security purposes. Some of the common uses are access control and video scanning. We didn't really get into too much video scanning. I think you all know how it works, right? The camera is used, it picks out faces, it looks for certain biomarkers in the face, and it says there indeed is a potential match with a person that we have in the database. It's always a matching kind of a thing, right? It can't identify somebody unless there's a match to identify against. The pros and cons of various devices and methods, and every one of them has pros and every one of them has cons. Think about what the future might hold. And then as we're going to discuss privacy next week, I want you to really keep an eye on what you think about privacy in these devices. There is no mandate to use biodigital devices. You can get higher level of security out of biodigital devices if you have multiple authentications. You run a badge and you run your fingerprints perhaps. That's a dual authentication. Now we know that you have a badge, and we know that that is indeed you because it's matched up. The badge matches up, the name on the badge matched up with the hand that was presented. It's great for dual authentication, great for added security, but in the normal course of business, do you need that level? And that is what you should always ask because of the privacy issues. So takeaways, definitions, common uses, pros and cons of each one of the methods we talked about. And I really want you to start to think about the future and think about what else could be used, and then think about the pros and cons in terms of privacy. Again, we're going to really get into that next week, which is kind of an interesting thing for me because I've been really dealing with the global Data Privacy Acts out of Europe and the California laws and some others that are really interesting, and I think you'll find it to be an interesting discussion. So with that, we're right about the 45-minute mark. There's some reading this week, pages 175 through 185 of the text. For those who didn't see my note, if indeed you didn't bring your text with you and you have not been back to campus, VitalSource Bookshelf is an app you can download. The folks at VitalSource have been very kind to lend for the remainder of the semester any textbooks that they have in their system, and they have almost all textbooks in their system, ours included. If you need a digital copy of it, you can download it from VitalSource. There'll be no charge for the remainder of this semester, and it disappears at the end of the semester. But just 175 to 185. We'll read the rest of that chapter for next week, but I don't want you to jump ahead too much on that because I want you to stay focused on just this topic. There's a New York Times article. It's about privacy and voice recognition. I just found it to be a very interesting article, and it'll get you thinking again about for next week. The video from Ademia on their MorphoWave product. Again, not a endorsement, but a really cool product. It is something that I am going to use, and I did have it tested for cybersecurity just recently, and so it's a pretty secure device. It is in use at the Hudson Yards area in New York City, which is the new World Trade Center area, quite frankly, for business with great success. So just wanted you to see that product in general, but there are other brands that are just like it. You've finished the lecture now. Congratulations. Thank you for your attention. Watch for project updates this week. I'm going to be releasing a budget and a price list this week. So you're going to find that when you look at your drawings that you've done, you may already be over budget and you may have to trim things back. And then when we start adding cameras, it's going to get even more expensive. So this will be your gut check. And with that, just be well. Wash your hands, social distancing, all those great things. I know you're tired of hearing about them, but they are hugely important to people you don't know that can be infected. I will tell you that this particular virus is no fun, and real people are getting affected by it, so we need you to do all those great things to protect your neighbors. Have a great week.